March 6, 1945. Interrogation Room 7, Prisoner of War Camp, Fort Hunt, Virginia. Generalmajor Adolf Galland sat across from his American interrogators, chain-smoking cigarettes, his Iron Cross still pinned to his Luftwaffe uniform despite his capture 3 weeks earlier. The German ace, credited with 104 aerial victories, had just been asked a simple question: how did Germany lose air superiority over Europe? His answer would stun the room into silence. "You didn't just defeat us," Galland said, exhaling smoke toward the ceiling. "You buried us under a mountain of metal we couldn't even comprehend. 750,000 sorties. In 3 years. We calculated it was impossible. Our mathematicians, our strategists, our finest minds all agreed no nation on Earth possessed such industrial capacity. We were wrong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." The number hung in the air like the smoke from Galland's cigarette. 750,000 bomber sorties. To put that in perspective, that averaged nearly 700 missions every single day for 3 straight years. The Luftwaffe's entire bomber force at the height of the Battle of Britain had managed roughly 50,000 sorties over England in 4 months, and that effort had nearly broken them. What the Americans had accomplished didn't just defy German expectations. It shattered every assumption about modern warfare, industrial capacity, and the very limits of what a democracy at war could achieve. This is the story of the greatest aerial campaign in human history, a logistical and manufacturing miracle so vast that even the Germans fighting against it refused to believe the numbers until their cities lay in ruins. It's a story of assembly lines that never stopped, of young men who flew into hell day after day, of an industrial machine that transformed American society and redrew the boundaries of human achievement. What emerged from American factories between 1942 and 1945 would change warfare forever and prove that totalitarian efficiency was no match for democratic determination backed by unleashed industrial might. The crisis began not in 1945, but 3 years earlier, in the smoking ruins of Pearl Harbor. December 7, 1941, forced America into a war it had desperately tried to avoid. Within weeks, American military planners faced a strategic nightmare that seemed to have no solution. Germany controlled virtually all of continental Europe. The Wehrmacht had conquered France in 6 weeks, a feat that had taken 4 years of grinding trench warfare in the previous World War. The Luftwaffe had proven itself the most effective air force ever created, destroying the Polish Air Force in 3 days and nearly breaking Britain during the Blitz. Japan, meanwhile, had seized control of the Pacific with shocking speed, capturing territories from Manchuria to the Philippines, from Burma to the Dutch East Indies. American military strength in early 1942 consisted of an army smaller than Romania's and an industrial base still operating at peacetime capacity. The situation appeared hopeless. Britain stood alone in Europe, battered and besieged, barely surviving on American Lend-Lease supplies ferried across U-boat-infested Atlantic waters. The Soviet Union, despite its vast manpower, was reeling from catastrophic defeats, with German forces pushing toward Moscow, Leningrad, and the oil fields of the Caucasus. American strategists understood that defeating Germany required reaching its heartland, but how? A ground invasion of continental Europe in 1942 would be suicidal. The Germans had spent 2 years fortifying their conquered territories, and the disastrous Dieppe raid in August 1942 would prove just how costly any amphibious assault would be. But there was another option, one that played to America's strengths rather than its weaknesses. Strategic bombing. The theory was elegant in its simplicity. If you couldn't reach Germany by land or sea, you could reach it by air. Destroy German industry, cripple war production, break civilian morale, and force the Luftwaffe into a war of attrition it couldn't win. The British had already been attempting strategic bombing since 1940, but with limited success. RAF Bomber Command under Air Marshal Arthur Harris had adopted nighttime area bombing because British bombers couldn't survive in German airspace during daylight. The raids inflicted damage but couldn't achieve the precision needed to truly cripple German war production. American doctrine, however, centered on a different approach. Daylight precision bombing. The theory held that heavily armed bombers flying in tight formation could fight their way to targets, destroy them with unprecedented accuracy using the revolutionary Norden bombsight, and fight their way home. On paper, it was brilliant. In practice, it would prove to be one of the bloodiest campaigns in military history. The man tasked with making this vision reality was General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the United States Army Air Forces. Arnold was a true believer in air power, convinced that strategic bombing could win the war without the need for massive ground invasions that would replicate the horrors of World War I's trenches. But in early 1942, Arnold faced obstacles that would have overwhelmed the less determined man. America's bomber force was tiny. The country that would eventually fly 750,000 sorties over Europe began the war with fewer than 2,000 heavy bombers total, most of them obsolete models unsuited for combat over Europe. The newest American heavy bomber, the B-17 Flying Fortress, had been in production since 1938, but fewer than 200 existed when war was declared. The alternative, the B-24 Liberator, was even newer and even scarcer. Both aircraft were technological marvels, bristling with machine guns and capable of carrying massive bomb loads over vast distances. But they were also complex machines requiring thousands of man-hours to build and hundreds of highly trained crew members to operate. Arnold needed not hundreds of these bombers, but tens of thousands. He needed them crewed, maintained, and ready for combat. And he needed them immediately. The challenge seemed insurmountable. German aircraft production in 1942 was already massive, with factories across occupied Europe churning out fighters and bombers around the clock. The Luftwaffe could draw on the industrial resources of an entire conquered continent. How could America, still mobilizing for war, possibly match that output while simultaneously building a navy to fight Japan, an army to invade Europe, and all the tanks, trucks, ships, and weapons needed to sustain global warfare? The answer would come not from military genius but from American industry, and specifically from a revolution in manufacturing that would transform the world. In March 1942, Arnold convened a meeting at the Pentagon with the heads of America's major aircraft manufacturers. Boeing, Consolidated, Douglas, Lockheed, and others sent their top executives, expecting another government plea for increased production. What they got instead was a demand that seemed to border on insanity. Arnold wanted bomber production increased by a factor of 10 within 18 months. Not 10%. Not doubled. 10 times current output. The executives were stunned. Current production methods couldn't possibly achieve such numbers. Aircraft manufacturing in 1942 was still partially a craft industry, with skilled workers hand-fitting components and making adjustments for each individual airframe. Building a B-17 took approximately 30,000 man-hours using conventional methods. Even working around the clock, there was no way to produce the numbers Arnold demanded. But Arnold had an ace up his sleeve. He'd been working with civilian industrial consultants, including advisors from the automotive industry, who believed aircraft production could be revolutionized using assembly line techniques pioneered by Henry Ford. The idea was radical. Aircraft weren't cars. They were vastly more complex, with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch and systems that had to function flawlessly at 30,000 feet and temperatures far below zero. But what if you could break down aircraft construction into standardized, repeatable processes? What if you could train semi-skilled workers to perform specific tasks rather than requiring master craftsmen for every component? What if you could build not custom aircraft but standardized machines rolling off assembly lines like automobiles? The manufacturers were skeptical, but they had little choice. The government was prepared to fund the construction of entirely new factories if existing companies wouldn't cooperate. Within months, a transformation began that would change manufacturing forever. In Willow Run, Michigan, Ford Motor Company broke ground on a factory that would become the largest single manufacturing plant ever constructed. The main assembly building stretched over 3 million square feet, with a footprint so massive it had its own internal transit system. Ford engineers, who had never built an aircraft, studied the B-24 Liberator and completely reimagined how it could be manufactured. The traditional method involved building major sections separately, then carefully assembling them with extensive hand-fitting and adjustment. Ford's method broke the aircraft down into thousands of sub-assemblies that could be built by workers with minimal training, then brought together on a moving assembly line where they clicked into place with tolerances so precise that hand-fitting became unnecessary. In Seattle, Boeing transformed its B-17 production using similar principles. The company built 3 massive new facilities and pioneered techniques like interchangeable parts manufacturing, where components built in different factories could be installed in any airframe without modification. In Fort Worth, Consolidated built a factory specifically designed around the assembly line concept, with production stations arranged to minimize worker movement and maximize efficiency. But factories were only part of the solution. Arnold also needed crews. Flying a heavy bomber required 10 men working in perfect coordination: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, flight engineer, radio operator, and 4 gunners. Each position required months of specialized training. A B-17 pilot needed to master flying a 4-engine aircraft weighing 32 tons, often on 3 engines or even 2, through weather that would ground commercial aviation, while under fire from enemy fighters and anti-aircraft guns. The navigator had to find targets hundreds of miles distant using dead reckoning and celestial navigation, often through clouds and smoke, with accuracy measured in hundreds of yards. The bombardier needed to operate the complex Norden bomb sight, a top-secret analog computer that calculated bomb trajectory accounting for altitude, airspeed, wind, and target movement. Training these crews required creating an entirely new educational infrastructure. The Army Air Forces built training bases across the American South and Southwest, taking advantage of good weather for year-round flying. Young men, most barely out of high school, learned to fly aircraft more complex than anything in civilian aviation. The washout rate was staggering. More than 40% of pilot candidates failed to complete training, unable to master the demanding skills required. Those who succeeded graduated into B-17 and B-24 transition training, where they learned formation flying, high-altitude operations, and the brutal realities of combat bombing. Crew training followed a rigid progression. First came individual skill training, where each specialist mastered their position. Then came crew integration, where 10 strangers learned to function as a single organism. Finally came combat simulation, where instructors threw every conceivable emergency at them: engine failures, oxygen system malfunctions, fighter attacks, flak damage. The goal was simple: make training harder than combat so that when crews faced the real thing, their responses would be automatic. By mid-1943, the training pipeline was producing more than 2,000 qualified heavy bomber crews every month. But that created yet another challenge. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Where would they all go? The answer was England. The British Isles would become the unsinkable aircraft carrier from which American air power would strike Germany. But basing hundreds of heavy bomber groups in England required solving logistical problems of staggering complexity. Each bomber base needed runways capable of handling aircraft weighing 32 tons fully loaded. They needed hangars for maintenance, barracks for crews, mess halls, hospitals, ammunition storage, fuel tanks holding hundreds of thousands of gallons of high-octane aviation gas, and bomb dumps storing thousands of tons of high explosives. All of this had to be built in a country already stretched thin by years of war, on an island being regularly bombed by the Luftwaffe, using materials that had to be shipped across an ocean patrolled by German submarines. Yet somehow, it happened. American construction battalions descended on the English countryside, transforming farms and fields into sprawling air bases virtually overnight. At the peak of construction in 1943, new bomber bases were being completed at a rate of 1 every 10 days. The British watched in amazement as American efficiency and resources created an aerial armada larger than anything the world had ever seen. By the end of 1943, the 8th Air Force in England operated from more than 100 bases and could launch raids involving more than 1,000 heavy bombers, each carrying up to 8,000 pounds of bombs. But the Germans were watching too, and they were preparing a reception that would turn American skies over Europe into killing grounds. Luftwaffe commanders had studied American bombing doctrine and identified what they believed was a fatal flaw. The heavily armed bombers might be able to defend themselves against small-scale fighter attacks, but what if you concentrated overwhelming force against them? What if you attacked with hundreds of fighters simultaneously, from multiple directions, using heavy cannon that could destroy bombers with a single hit? The Germans prepared a defensive system of devastating effectiveness. Fighter bases ringed occupied Europe, positioned to provide overlapping coverage against bomber formations. Radar stations tracked American formations from the moment they crossed the English coast. Ground controllers vectored fighters to intercept points, coordinating attacks for maximum effect. The fighters themselves were deadly. The Focke-Wulf FW-190 and Messerschmitt Bf-109 were fast, maneuverable, and heavily armed. German pilots, many of them veterans with years of combat experience, had developed tactics specifically designed to crack bomber formations. They would approach from 12 o'clock high, directly ahead and above, where the bombers had the least defensive firepower. They would dive through the formation at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour, firing cannon and machine guns, then break away before defensive fire could track them. If they could knock out the lead bomber, the entire formation might scatter, making the rest easy prey. The Americans were about to discover that their theories about self-defending bomber formations would be tested in the most brutal way possible. The bloodiest lessons were still to come, lessons written in the contrails of burning bombers falling from 30,000 feet, in the frozen bodies of gunners killed at their posts, in the shattered dreams of crews who survived one mission only to face 24 more before they could go home. The stage was set for the greatest industrial and military campaign in history, a campaign that would see American bombers darken European skies day after day, year after year, until even the Germans who had dismissed American capability would be forced to admit the impossible had become reality. August 17, 1943. Regensburg and Schweinfurt, Germany. The date would become known as Black Thursday among American aircrews, a day when theory collided with reality at 25,000 feet over occupied Europe. 230 B-17 Flying Fortresses departed England that morning on what planners called a shuttle mission. Half would strike the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg, then continue to North Africa. The other half would hit the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, then return to England. The plan assumed the Luftwaffe couldn't intercept both formations effectively. The plan was catastrophically wrong. Lieutenant Robert Morgan, piloting AB-17 named Memphis Belle on what would be one of her final missions, watched German fighters swarm the formation like angry hornets. They didn't attack in ones or twos as doctrine predicted. They came in waves of 50 or more, pressing attacks with a ferocity that suggested they knew exactly how vital these targets were. The first bomber fell within minutes of crossing into German airspace, a direct hit to the cockpit that sent the massive aircraft into a slow, graceful spiral toward the earth below. No parachutes emerged. Then another fell, and another. The radio filled with urgent calls as formations tried to close gaps left by falling aircraft. What American planners hadn't fully grasped was that the Luftwaffe had been preparing for exactly this scenario. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring had ordered the creation of specialized bomber-destroyer units equipped with heavy cannon and rockets. These fighters didn't attempt the nimble dogfighting Americans expected. Instead, they stood off at ranges where defensive machine guns were ineffective and fired devastating salvos of 20mm and 30mm cannon shells. A single hit could tear a wing off. 2 or 3 hits would break a bomber in half. The Germans had also developed a tactic called the company front attack. Entire squadrons would form line abreast, then charge straight through bomber formations, all firing simultaneously. The defensive crossfire that was supposed to protect the bombers became meaningless when 50 fighters attacked from the same direction within seconds of each other. Staff Sergeant Michael Aruth, ball turret gunner on AB-17 named Banshee, had a front row seat to the slaughter. Suspended in a plexiglass sphere beneath the aircraft, he could see everything. He watched a bomber to his left take a direct hit to the No. 3 engine. The engine tore free from its mount, cartwheeled back through the formation, and struck another bomber's tail section. Both aircraft fell. He saw parachutes blossom as crews bailed out, white flowers against the dark earth below. Then he saw German fighters strafe the descending airmen, a violation of every convention of warfare but tactically effective. Fewer prisoners meant less intelligence for the Americans. The Regensburg force lost 24 bombers before reaching the target. The Schweinfurt force fared even worse, losing 36 aircraft. In total, 60 bombers failed to return from the mission, with another 100 damaged so badly they would never fly again. 600 men were dead, missing, or prisoners. The loss rate exceeded 25%, a figure that would make the mission unsustainable if repeated. But the Americans did repeat it. Again and again and again. This was the terrible calculus at the heart of the strategic bombing campaign. The losses were horrific by any measure, but they were sustainable in a way German losses were not. America's industrial machine was producing bombers faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy them. In August 1943, the same month as Black Thursday, American factories delivered more than 500 new heavy bombers. The Germans had shot down 60, a victory by any tactical measure, but strategically meaningless. The American bomber force was growing despite the losses. By September, there were more B-17s and B-24s in England than there had been before Black Thursday. The replacements brought fresh crews, young men who had read about the losses in newspapers back home but climbed into their aircraft anyway because someone had to. The 8th Air Force commander, General Ira Eaker, faced a crisis of morale and mathematics. Every crew was required to complete 25 missions before rotating home. After Black Thursday, the average crew survival rate meant that fewer than 1 in 4 would complete their tour. The odds were worse than Russian roulette with 2 bullets in the cylinder. Men were calculating their chances and realizing they were almost certainly going to die. Some broke down completely, unable to function. Others became fatalistic, going through the motions because death seemed inevitable anyway. A few became reckless, volunteering for the most dangerous missions because waiting for death was worse than meeting it head-on. But Eaker also recognized something the Germans had missed. The Luftwaffe was winning battles but losing the war. Every fighter the Germans concentrated against bombers was a fighter not available for the Eastern Front, where Soviet forces were beginning their inexorable advance. Every pilot killed defending German industry was irreplaceable, while American losses, though terrible, could be replaced within weeks. The bombing campaign was forcing Germany into a war of attrition it couldn't win. German aircraft production was indeed increasing, but so was the diversion of resources to defensive fighters rather than offensive capabilities. The solution to the bomber losses came not from better tactics or heavier armament, but from an unexpected source. Long-range fighter escorts. For the first 2 years of the campaign, American bombers had flown unescorted over Germany because no fighter had the range to accompany them. The P-47 Thunderbolt could escort bombers partway, but had to turn back before reaching most German targets. The solution arrived in December 1943 in the form of the P-51 Mustang, equipped with drop tanks that gave it the range to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The impact was immediate and devastating to the Luftwaffe. German fighters that had previously been able to attack bombers with near impunity now had to fight their way through swarms of Mustangs. The P-51 was faster than any German fighter, more maneuverable at high altitude, and piloted by American flyers eager to prove themselves in air-to-air combat. What had been a turkey shoot for the Luftwaffe became a death trap. In the first 3 months of 1944, the Luftwaffe lost more than 1,000 pilots killed or seriously wounded, losses they could never replace. The experienced aces who had terrorized bomber formations were being systematically eliminated, replaced by teenagers with minimal training who died within their first few missions. But the true measure of American industrial might wasn't just in the bombers or the fighters. It was in the entire logistics chain that kept them flying. Every mission required meticulous preparation that began days in advance. Intelligence officers analyzed reconnaissance photos to identify targets and defensive positions. Weather officers studied atmospheric conditions, planning routes that would minimize contrails and maximize cloud cover. Ordnance crews loaded bombs, a dangerous task given that each bomber carried up to 4 tons of high explosives. Armorers loaded ammunition belts for the 13 machine guns each B-17 carried, a total of 6,000 rounds per aircraft. Ground crews performed maintenance that would make civilian aviation standards seem lax. Every bomber received a complete inspection after every mission. Engines were tested, control surfaces examined, oxygen systems checked, and any battle damage repaired. A single bomber required a ground crew of more than 30 specialists working around the clock. Multiply that by 1,000 bombers, and you begin to understand the scale of the operation. The 8th Air Force in England employed more than 200,000 personnel, of whom only about 15,000 were actual aircrew. The rest were the invisible army that made the missions possible. Fueling alone was a logistics nightmare. Each B-17 carried 2,700 gallons of high-octane aviation gasoline. A 1,000-plane raid required nearly 3 million gallons of fuel, all of which had to be shipped from America, stored safely, and distributed to individual aircraft. The fuel trucks that serviced the bombers logged millions of miles crisscrossing English airfields. A single supply disruption could ground the entire force, which is exactly what the Luftwaffe tried to achieve by targeting fuel depots and supply lines. The bomb loads represented an even more impressive feat of logistics. A typical mission might drop 3,000 tons of ordnance on a single target. That meant manufacturing, shipping, storing, and loading 3,000 tons of explosives without a single accident that could destroy an entire base. The bombs themselves came in bewildering variety. General-purpose bombs for area targets. Armor-piercing bombs for hardened structures. Incendiary bombs for firestorms. Each type required different handling procedures, different fuses, different loading techniques. Ordnance crews became experts in explosives, working with materials that could vaporize them if mishandled. Then there was the human cost beyond the aircrew casualties. Ground personnel died too, killed in accidents, in German bombing raids on English bases, in training mishaps. For every dramatic story of a bomber shot down over Germany, there were quieter tragedies of mechanics killed by propeller strikes, ordnance handlers blown apart by accidental detonations, truck drivers who died in crashes on blacked-out English roads. The bombing campaign consumed lives the way factories consumed raw materials, relentlessly and without pause. Yet the missions continued with mechanical regularity. Every day the weather permitted, bomber streams assembled over England in carefully choreographed aerial ballets. Hundreds of aircraft, each weighing 16 tons empty, would spiral upward from dozens of bases, forming into combat boxes at assigned altitudes. The formation stretched for miles, a river of aluminum flowing east toward occupied Europe. German radar operators watched the buildups with growing dread, knowing that within hours, thousands of tons of explosives would fall on their homeland. The targets evolved as the campaign progressed. Initially, planners focused on precision strikes against specific industrial facilities. The ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt. The synthetic oil refineries at Ploesti. The aircraft factories at Regensburg. But precision bombing from 25,000 feet proved far more difficult than peacetime tests suggested. Clouds obscured targets. Smoke from earlier hits drifted across aim points. Anti-aircraft fire forced evasive action at the critical moment. The revolutionary Norden bomb sight, which theoretically could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 4 miles up, achieved nowhere near that accuracy in combat conditions. By 1944, the campaign had shifted toward area bombing of industrial cities. The distinction between military and civilian targets blurred, then disappeared entirely. The bombing of Dresden in February 1945 would kill an estimated 25,000 people in a single night, most of them civilians. Hamburg had burned in firestorms that killed 40,000. The moral implications of strategic bombing would haunt participants for decades. Were they liberators destroying the Nazi war machine, or were they perpetrators of war crimes against civilian populations? The aircrews themselves struggled with these questions. They could see the fires they started. They could watch entire city blocks consumed by flame. Some bombardiers refused to release their loads over obviously residential areas, bringing their bombs home rather than kill civilians. Others rationalized it as necessary to end the war quickly, saving lives in the long run by shortening the conflict. Most simply tried not to think about it, focusing on survival rather than morality. What couldn't be questioned was the campaign's effectiveness in destroying German industry. By early 1945, German war production had collapsed. The synthetic oil plants that had kept the Wehrmacht mobile lay in ruins. Aircraft factories were rubble. Ball bearing production had been reduced to a fraction of peacetime levels. The transportation network that distributed materials and finished products had been systematically dismantled by precision strikes on rail yards, bridges, and canal systems. Germany was being starved of the resources needed to continue the war. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, had been reduced to desperate improvisation. Jet aircraft like the Me-262 appeared too late and in too few numbers to change the outcome. Pilots with minimal training flew outdated aircraft with insufficient fuel, often making only 1 or 2 flights before being killed or captured. The same air force that had terrorized Europe in 1940 could barely contest American air supremacy by 1945. The skies over Germany belonged to the Americans, who flew daylight missions with near impunity, dropping bombs with such regularity that German civilians could set their watches by the arrival of the bomber streams. Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe general who would later sit in that interrogation room expressing disbelief at American capabilities, had watched this transformation with growing horror. In 1943, he had commanded fighter forces that savaged American bomber formations. By 1945, he was leading a squadron of Me-262 jets in desperate attempts to stem a tide that had become unstoppable. His pilots shot down American bombers, but for every bomber destroyed, 2 more appeared. For every German pilot who survived, 3 were killed. The mathematics were inexorable and unforgiving. The final missions of the European campaign flew in April 1945, as Allied ground forces closed in on Berlin from east and west. By then, there were few targets left worth bombing. The German economy had ceased to function. Cities lay in ruins. The transportation network had been so thoroughly destroyed that even basic distribution of food and medicine had become impossible in many areas. The Americans had achieved what they set out to do, though at a cost that would have seemed unthinkable in 1942. In 3 years of sustained operations, American bomber forces had flown 750,000 sorties over Europe. They had dropped more than 2 million tons of bombs. They had destroyed thousands of industrial facilities, crippled German infrastructure, and forced the diversion of enormous resources to air defense. But the human cost had been staggering. More than 40,000 American airmen had been killed in action. Another 40,000 had been wounded, many horrifically. Tens of thousands more had been captured and spent years in prisoner of war camps. The casualty rate among bomber crews exceeded that of infantry units, making the 8th Air Force one of the deadliest assignments in the American military. For the crews who survived, the psychological scars ran deep. They had watched friends die in flames. They had seen things no human should see. They had participated in the destruction of entire cities. Many would struggle with trauma for the rest of their lives, though in an era before PTSD was recognized as a medical condition, they were expected to simply move on. Some managed. Others didn't. The price of victory included not just those who died, but those who survived damaged in ways that would never fully heal. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.